I've been in the technology sector for a long time, over 20 years. So I don't reveal my age. I'm not going to say how long. And I've worked in different areas, and I had a business, a business that was doing well prior to lockdown. And then when lockdown happened, things changed. All of our priorities changed. And then we came across this big problem around reimbursing volunteer expenses. And we've been, both me and my business partner, we've been in the payment industry for a while, digital payments. So we turned our focus to that. We applied for a government grant and we started vHelp. And that was our first time in working in the third sector, in the charity sector. And we never looked back. We absolutely love working within the volunteering sector. We love working with charities. So that's just a little bit of background about myself. With regards to the session, I would love the session to be as interactive as possible. I would not, so I have about 3 topics that I want to talk about. And after each one, I'll probably pause a little bit and get some questions. Maybe Alex and Chris can help me read out some questions so we can make it as interactive as possible. There's no way I'm going to be talking at you for a whole hour. That'd be very boring. So, so today I want to talk about money. Obviously, as vHelp is all about handling and processing payments, today we will be talking about money in the context of volunteering and how should this look by 2030. Let's face it, we all hate talking about money, but it's an important topic, especially in today's cost of living crisis. So we kind of have to. So when Chris kind of approached me about the topic, I thought, okay, volunteering 2030. And of course, my technical mindset kicked in. I was thinking about all these cool things. And before you know it, I was thinking flying saucers and all these things we can do by 2030 with volunteering and technology. And then I brought myself back down to earth and I thought, actually, no, that's not what people want to hear. 2030 is only 8 years from now. So I need to be a little bit more ambitious, realistic about those ambitions. So the way I thought about it is I looked at, so we work with volunteers, we work very closely with volunteer managers and of course, senior management and senior leadership within organizations. And I wanted to see about what are the themes that we constantly come across. And that's how I kind of came up with the 3 ambitions that I have for volunteering in 2030 in the context of handling money. The first one will be to be transparent when dealing with money, to be inclusive, and that is in the context of expenses and making sure volunteers are included, and to adopt technology to save money. So I'll take the first one and I'll dive into it. So be transparent. What do I mean by that? We often see all of these call out for volunteers, and I'm very curious. So I'm always clicking on these call out for volunteers, the NHS call out, all sorts of different call out. And you see volunteers needed, your help is needed, but you never see transparency about expenses. There's hardly any talk at that stage of volunteer recruitment. There's hardly any talk about expenses. So often the volunteer will have to sign up and go through a vetting process before they get any visibility to any expense policies. Now that could be the decision to volunteer for this organization or not for that particular volunteer. So it's really, really important to be transparent about money in that at that early stage of your kind of recruitment of volunteers, because it will save you time as well. If you think about it, all these volunteers are going through the process, and then when they find out that you don't pay expenses or you don't pay enough to cover their expenses, and then they abandon you, you've wasted that time too. And I tell you what, back to people hating to talk about money, volunteers hardly ever pick up the phone or drop you a line and ask if you pay expenses because they're embarrassed about it. Because we're all embarrassed about it. Who wants to show that, oh, I need that £5? But what we need, we have to answer that question for them. So we need to not just kind of document those processes, we need to make them public. we need to inform these volunteers. If you don't want to put your policies right up there, then you probably need to kind of put bullet points on your website. Whenever you're hiring volunteers, just put 3 bullet points. We pay for transport up to £10. We pay for lunch if you spend more than, just the main things you need to mention when you're recruiting those volunteers. That is really, really important to give those volunteers that transparency. Now, I've seen some charities that are kind of afraid of being transparent because they think if they say that we pay expenses, then they get more claims. Rest assured, we've done comparisons between charities that are very kind of transparent about it and charities that don't talk about it. It doesn't increase your number of claims. People who claim will claim, and probably claim even if the process is convoluted and difficult. If they need the money, they will claim. So it just makes you more kind of approachable and transparent organization if you open up and talk about those topics. Do we have any questions on that first point? So that's my first ambition. Is like, people, we need to be transparent. Organizations need to talk about it. Does anyone have a challenge for me?
If anybody wants to put questions in the chat, if they're a bit nervous to speak out loud, or pop your hand up and we'll turn your mic on and we can just make it a nice open forum. Or maybe it's just total agreement with you, Randa, that everybody agrees.
I think Flora was...
Randa, do you think that it's enough just to offer it? Because I know a lot of our volunteers don't claim. Do you think we should have an understanding of like the rate of, you know, people who claim, and we should be, you know, encouraging it, or is it just enough to offer it?
So it is definitely the minimum, I would say, is to offer it. And if you encourage it, that's amazing. The more you encourage it, the more you retain your volunteers. So, and by encouraging it, so it's actually, you kind of brought something interesting. Encouraging it and keeping a little bit of privacy around it is very important. So volunteers are sometimes embarrassed to talk amongst each other about expenses. So perhaps you should encourage it in a kind of generic, we would never approach like certain volunteers and say you can claim and you can, but just make sure you communicate it via emails, you communicate it in your, and remind people and make it easy for people to claim.
Yeah.
Sorry, we've got a question here from Dolores. Do you think we should pay full HMRC mileage rates or part and advise how to claim the rest back from HMRC? Great question. Oh,
so I know that charities are actually fighting to pay more because of the fuel crisis at the moment. So the minimum is 45p, isn't it, per mile? So I guess it's a hard one for me to answer on behalf of your charity. It's what you can pay, but I would say the minimum should be the 45p.
In terms, because I think what Doris is getting at is you can also put a personal claim in for the difference. So if the charity pays 25p, the volunteer is able to pay claim the rest back as a tax rebate. But it is quite complicated, and you can maybe produce something for volunteers to support them in doing that. But I can't imagine many, unless they're accountants, doing it. Yeah,
or you might say we'll pay half of your mileage and pay 45p. So, for example, if somebody's used 10 miles, you'll pay for 5 of those miles, and this way, it becomes more straightforward. But, again, I think recently there's been a lot of talk, and there was a BBC article, and we actually wrote about it, and Rob Jackson wrote about it. It is, paying mileage has become so important because people are starting to lose volunteers. If they're, the cost of fuel is just going up, and people have to kind of, instead of just few quid, it's turning into tens of pounds, isn't it? So I think if you want to retain your volunteers, it's really important to have a think about that and challenge your management about paying the full 45p.
Audrey's mentioned as well, and this is one me and you've talked about before, Randa. I know it generates more work, yet they can claim expenses and return it as a donation.
Oh, that's a very interesting one. The donation. So this is a beautiful concept, but sadly, HMRC is keeping it as a concept. So we have been we're trying to push HMRC to know. So with vHelp, we enabled very smooth kind of expense claim. And at the start, we even built the technology to enable the volunteer to donate this money back and just show it as a transaction, an accountant transaction. And we thought, this is beautiful. The charities are going to be able to raise money with that. But we went back to confirm it with HMRC, and HMRC said to us, no, you have to physically give the volunteer money and physically get the money back from the volunteer in order to qualify for that. We consulted with the charities we're working with at the time, and they thought that is more risk because they'll end up paying people and never actually getting the money back, people who never wanted to claim in the first place. So we kind of dropped that. But we still hope that at some point, when we have the backing of a very big charity, we go and challenge that. But
yeah,
we can't.
That was for the benefit of gift aid, wasn't it, Randa? So the charity could benefit from the gift aid of the donation of the expenses back to the organisation. That was the.
Sorry. Yeah. So that is, I didn't mention the bit. Yeah. So to qualify for gift aid, you have to, and if we had done, and we can do that technically, but we end up paying most of the money to the transaction companies, basically, which is not worth it. You know, the charity will be left with hardly anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right.
Anybody else want to mention anything at this point, or any more questions for Randa about the transparency element? Lorna's come through here. Although we pay and mention expenses when I do volunteer check-ins, I often find volunteers are reluctant to claim expenses as they feel they're taking money from the charity.
Just say that again.
Sorry. Although we pay and I mention expenses when I do a volunteer check-in, I often find volunteers are reluctant to claim expenses as they feel they are taking money from the charity.
Okay, so you feel they're taking money from the charity.
Do you want me to explain? So often, if volunteers are volunteering to support and help the charity, they kind of feel like if I'm giving them their expenses, even though that's something that they themselves have incurred, that they're kind of taking our money.
Oh, that is sweet.
So they're quite often reluctant to then claim the expenses back.
Yeah, that is very sweet, actually. And we see that a lot, that volunteers kind of, but we have to kind of be careful that they're not putting themselves under pressure in doing that. So they have to understand that you probably got the funding for that. So you have to make it okay for them. So I know some charities shy away of talking. And again, that's about the transparency. If you don't talk about it and make it okay for volunteers, they feel embarrassed and feel that they are taking money from charity. But I think if you encourage it, like Flora was talking about earlier, if you encourage it and tell them that you have specific funding for that, then they don't feel that they are kind of taking away from you. Especially if you know the volunteers need it, you really have to push it if they need it.
Yeah, it's something I'm wondering with cost of living, you know, if it will become something that more of them do start now claiming for.
Yeah. And they should, if you want them to stay with you, honestly, that's where you really need to encourage it, because they'll be embarrassed to turn around and say. So even those charities that, you know, the people that are driving, the volunteer drivers are just dropping off because they feel bad for their charity, but actually they're doing the charity more harm by dropping off than asking for their claims to be paid. Does that make sense?
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Cool. Shall we move to the next topic, or do we have any more questions? Okay. So that's transparency. I'm really hoping that we all become really transparent about that by 2030. The next one is be inclusive. And I'm sure you're having like talks about inclusive day, and we're hearing so much about inclusion, especially in the volunteering sector. But I think there's still more to be done in the context of expenses. Now, I've seen the charities that don't pay expenses, they end up with one demographic of volunteers, and that is white, middle-aged, well-off, basically, because these people don't need the money. If you want your volunteer force to be representable, to be inclusive, to have different ages, to have young people, you really need to focus on, again, talking about money, paying expenses. I'll give you an example. I was born and brought up in Iraq. I came to the UK in 1997 as a refugee. And when I came and started to settle down, finding my feet, the first thing I wanted to do I actually was advised to do it. I used to kind of attend all these sessions to improve my English and so on. And someone told me to volunteer to improve my English. And at the time, I was completely broke. For me to travel from West to East London cost me about £3.50. And if that charity at the time didn't pay me, that it was a tiny AIDS charity, it was a very sweet kind of group of people. And if they hadn't paid me that £3.50, I don't think I would have ever made it there. And, you know, if you think about all of this, the subsequent kind of effects on that, I improved my English, I supported the charity, and I gained so much confidence out of that exercise. So you need to think of that context. You need to think about the Syrian refugees that are arriving today, which we have one volunteer who was doing 5 shifts during the vaccination, during COVID vaccinations. If that person doesn't get their expenses paid, they're never going to be able to volunteer. You need to think about your age demographics. Where are the young people? These young people can't afford to spend. I mean, traveling across London today costs about £10. They can't afford to be out of pocket for that. So if you want to be inclusive, you've got to talk about money. You've got to include, you know, expenses. You've got to pay these people so you can have that mixture of people. You have that mixture of cultures. You have those people bringing you those different stories with them. So that's my take on inclusion in relation to expenses and talking about money. Do we have any questions, challenges on that?
We do. Deborah Smith has said they've been looking at a solution that would enable them to pay expenses up front to enable people to access volunteering opportunities, almost like a fund, I guess, that volunteers may be able to take advantage of.
Excellent.
So that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Certainly, if it takes you quite a long time to pay expenses through your finance department, seems like a brilliant idea to me.
Absolutely. So that is another consideration, Chris, is how long does it take you to pay your volunteers? A lot of the organizations that we talk to, because they process before working with us, obviously, because they process expenses manually, it takes 2 to 6 weeks to pay expenses. So the fact that you're offering to pay expenses up front, that is absolutely incredible. That means they'll never even be out of pocket for a day. So keep up the good work. That is really, really good. And you should share with other charities how you're doing that.
Flora, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I don't understand how the paying in advance, you know, works, because, you know, you have to be really careful that you don't overpay, or you don't, you know, kind of pay, you know, kind of more than the volunteer is actually out of pocket. So you have to know, you know, 100% that person is going to be volunteering on that day, and someone's got to monitor that sort of all the time for all of your volunteers. I don't know how does that work?
Deborah, are you happy to explain what's happened on your project so far?
Hi there. I haven't been specifically involved in that, so I don't know exactly, but it's certainly something we've been looking to do. One of the projects that is run at North Herts Centre for Voluntary Service, which we're a project of, is a volunteer drivers scheme where they're taking people to hospital and other medical appointments. So I guess if you've got people who are doing things very, very regularly and then become trusted volunteers, that's less risky than giving sort of random new volunteers payments. But it's one thing I think that we need to consider with the cost of living crisis, and saying, well, some people are not going to be able to afford to do it, even though they might. really will be needed for that. I suppose like if you're been looking at a project about charity trustees, because we know it's a difficult to recruit, and if you need to go to a physical meeting, paying their expenses that upfront, that's a sort of one-off smallish payment. That seems quite reasonable. So it might very much depend on the context and to the volunteers and quite what they're doing, if that helps.
No, I think that's a fair point, that not all expenses are the same, and you can treat some differently to others. That makes sense. Helen, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I think I just reading what Deborah had said, I think there's maybe a subtle difference to explore there in terms of paying upfront and paying in advance. We certainly wouldn't be paying in advance in terms of, a flat rate or trying to guesstimate what somebody's expenses would be. It would need to be an expense incurred, obviously. So I think there's something, what I'm reading there with you, Deborah, is people exploring ways that it's more upfront, that they're not having to wait that time. Our organisation, for example, would definitely take 2 weeks to be paying a volunteer their expenses. So I think
so it's an agreed upfront expense rather than than an open ongoing expense that could be anything.
You could have a challenge with that is, let's say you allocated £10 and they only spent £6. There's normally, to get that money back, there is some sort of transaction fee or so, because I don't know, Deborah, what you guys use, but I know some charities, for example, use those prepaid cards, which are quite expensive to maintain, but they kept about 6 of them in the organization and paid about £7 for each card a month to and they give it out and the volunteer uses it and brings it back, which becomes another kind of admin nightmare. And there's a lot of upfront costs to that as well, because the charity has to commit to using those prepaid cards and paying an annual fee basically towards them. Right. Do we have any other question about inclusion in the context of expenses? Right, we can move to my final point, which is about adopting technology. I know it sounds kind of simple, but by 2030, I really hope that we are all on the same page about the importance of technology in the third sector. And, looking at technology as kind of a core service, it's not a luxury anymore. So we need to work together to help charities get there. Now, when we're working with charities about, and, especially around adopting technology, because we are a digital technology solution, we found that there is a general fear of technology. There is the fear of technology itself, and that normally comes from the charity team. They are worried about training. They are worried about the use of technology. Are we going to be able to use it? How much training does my team need? There is a lot of nervousness around technology. And I actually started to understand that when I started to kind of get some exposure to the kind of technology systems some charities use. Sadly, some charities are stuck with some legacy systems from, more than 10 years ago that are really difficult. You literally need a degree to use those systems. So they generally have a fear about moving forward and adopting new technology because they think they need to put everything on hold for a month in order to adopt a system. I always remind charities and tell them, so when they ask me questions about vHelp, do you offer training? I go, of course we offer training. And then they actually start using it and come back to me and go, oh, we don't need training. And I say to them, if you can order food online, if you can order at Just Eat, or if you can do an online shop, you can use vHelp. It is really simple. And that's not just vHelp. I'm sure TeamKinetic, and of course, but TeamKinetic probably more complex. You'll probably need more training on that. But technology these days is not as scary as it used to be. I've used Oracle systems, or I've used other big systems, and these technologies are really scary. So I understand why you're scared, but trust me on this one, we've come a long, long way, and we are in a much better place now, and it's not as scary anymore. Now, there is another fear, which is, what if my volunteers can't use technology? And I've written a blog about this recently, and it's on our vHelp blog site. And we kind of got to the bottom of that, the question of what if my volunteers don't use technology? And I think Chris will probably agree with me on that. There is about 5% of volunteers that can't use technology, right, Chris? Do you agree with that? The rest are...
Yeah, 5 or 10%, I'd say, that are sort of can't use it, to don't want to use it.
Yeah. I would actually go 5%, but I think by 2030, this will go down to probably 2%. And that 5% sometimes is holding back the organization. And of course, it's the nature of the charity sector, because they're so lovely and inclusive. They worry a lot about that 5%. And what we say to them, rather than hold back the benefits of using technology and the cost savings that come with that, you need to keep those manual processes for that 5%. You'll always probably have those people that need to use manual processes, whether it's volunteer management, whether it's expense management. Keep some manual processes for them. But then you still have the 95% of volunteers that can, you can kind of benefit from using technology with those volunteers. So don't be afraid. And actually, you would be surprised how today's volunteers are. So some charities might go, oh, the 5% depends on the demographics of that particular charity. And I go, actually, we're finding like 70-year-olds, 75-year-olds, they're using vHelp so comfortably. We have one of our case studies in Bradford. We're working with Bradford City Council. And this lady, we mentioned her on the case study, she was showing the young people how she uses the app and how she claims expenses and how she gets her expenses within 24 hours. So have some faith in your volunteers. Their technology is not that scary. And I really hope that you start, by 2030, we don't do admin anymore. We don't do manual work anymore. We use systems like TeamKinetic. We use volunteer management system. We use expense management system, because that will help you as a team focus on your core offering, which is charitable activities rather than admin. Then the other side of fear of technology, and I don't know, Chris, you agree with me on that, is the fear of the cost associated with technology. So a lot of charities are worried, how much is this going to cost me? Oh, how can I justify this cost to my funders? How? And again, I mean, going back to technology is not a luxury. Technology is the backbone of operation. For you to operate efficiently, you need technology in this day and age. You need a lean back office in order to help you focus on these charitable activities. The interesting thing that I found with the third sector is that areas like fundraising have really flourished online and digitally. And I think that was like Just Giving. It's been very successful. It's been really embraced by charities. And I think there is an element there about thinking, well, maybe because we're raising money here, it's okay to spend a little bit of money. But you need to kind of come to the next phase of thinking now, which is you need to look at cost cutting and cost saving. And that is something that technology will bring along. So you might think fundraising is okay to spend on, but actually cost cutting is also worth spending on and helping you be more efficient. You need to empower your volunteer managers to find the right tools. We need to kind of be allowing them to go out there and find the tools that enable them to do less admin and focus more on managing their volunteers, because we know managing volunteers is not an easy task, and they need to focus on these important things rather than just doing admin all day long. Now, one of the important things about the whole kind of justifying cost for new technology is building a business case. Business cases is kind of a scary thing, and I used to be scared of it. But rest assured, whenever you want a technology or technical solution, always go to that supplier and say to them, can you help me build a business case? And I'm going to really simplify it. A business case is basically just looking at how you're doing this task today, calculating the amount of time you spend on this task, and put a cost against that. And then you compare that to basically the cost of technology. And I guarantee you the cost is not going to be that different. You might still need to pay a little bit extra for technology, but the amount of time you save, and the fact that you're doing more of the stimulating work and you're satisfying your volunteers. I mean, in our case, the most important thing for charities is that they're paying their volunteers within 24 hours. That it's helping them with their volunteer retention. So even if there is a bit of a cost involved in that, they're accepting that cost. And last year we did a piece of research with Rob Jackson where we surveyed about 60 charities of various sizes. Some of them were very large, 10,000 employees and more, and down to community level charities. And we asked them the question. So we wanted to get to the bottom of how much people spend on processing expenses. So we asked questions about how much time is it taken to process an expense. And we found a lot of charities didn't actually understand that. Some charities thought they spent 10 hours to process an expense. Some charities thought they spent for half an hour. And of course, with conversations and with time, we started to understand that, these charities don't know how much time is spent because they haven't looked at these internal processes, even though it's a huge pain point for them. They all said that the amount of admin involved in processing expenses was really, really painful. Yet, they haven't stopped and thought about how much time they spent on it. Because if you stop and think about that time, you will also be able to associate how much money you're spending on it and how much saving, in effect, you can make by using a digital solution. So that's the important point I want to make about adopting technology, embracing technology, using it as a cost saving. And the last thing I would say, you need to be assertive when you go ask for funding. So volunteer managers, you really need to be assertive. When you go ask for funding, you need to put in that funding that you need to pay for software licenses. You need to pay for processing expenses. You need to put all these costs in. Don't hesitate. Again, you need to think that technology is the backbone of this operation. It's not a luxury, and therefore you need to kind of claim it. Recently, the BBC Children in Need, for the first time ever, they directly funding charities' core costs. So that is setting a really good example about, and they're funding technology as well. So that sets a really good example about what can you push for. So don't hold back, push for those costs, and hopefully by 2030, we're no longer using any manual processes and we're utilizing technology to the fullest. And that's my topic about adopting technology. Do we have any questions, any challenges?
I'm sure there's plenty of people on the call who've had their fair share of challenges with getting their organisation to adopt new technologies to help them do their job. Has anybody got anything they'd like to share, or any questions they'd like to ask Randa about how you build that business case in a way that is compelling?
Yeah, I'd love to hear about that.
No, everyone seems pretty quiet. I think everyone's had a big lunch and it's
Yes, I just want to share our experience, Amalis, from Volunteering Barnet. We are using vHelp as an organization, not very often because we don't have a lot of claims, but the few times we use it is actually really helpful because the volunteer find extremely easy to use. Say that the new feature that you guys are.
Oh, we lost you at the new feature. I was holding
through the website rather than
upload
an app. That was extremely useful.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and it's also quite fast, as it's been approved 24 hours. So the volunteers so far are very happy with it.
Oh, thank you
Thank
so
you,
much, Alice.
vHelp. You're welcome.
Which organization did you say you're from?
From Volunteering Barnet.
Oh, fantastic. Thank
Yes.
you for the shout out. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
no,
And
it's-
yes, yeah. So we recently kind of so originally when we started vHelp, it was an app only, but then we found people wanted to use the web as well. So we enable volunteers to make their claims on the web as well as the app. So thank you so much, Alice. It's really good to hear.
No worries. Thank you.
I'd just step in there and say that this is the plan for TeamKinetic as well, that you'll be able to access vHelp from the managed expenses component in TeamKinetic. So for your volunteers, it'll be pretty seamless and pretty friction-free.
Rolf,
Yeah.
when will that come?
We've been seeking test cases to test with vHelp with Randa. So I think we've got a few now that we can go forward and test. To be honest, I don't know how long that testing is going to take. But everything's in place, everything's aligned, ready. So it just depends how we get on with people and if it works and if there's anything to iron out. But I'm hopeful for, somewhere early next year we can start offering out in a more wide sense to anyone that's interested.
Brilliant. And by doing that, what we're trying to do to have the volunteer will only have one interface, which is TeamKinetic, and they make their claim. And the volunteer manager will just have to kind of come on vHelp and approve it. So that's the first phase of it. And then we can move on in the future. Go ahead, Chris. You're on mute.
I believe we've got 4 or 5 clients so far that have opted into that initial test group. But if anybody is interested, then please feel free to pop a message in the chat, and we can pop you in that initial group that maybe are sort of early adopters of this particular new feature set.
Brilliant.
Randa, can you tell us how vHelp actually works?
Yeah, sure. I mean, is that okay, Chris? I wouldn't turn this into a sales pitch. Okay.
No, of course. If people are interested, we're more than happy for you to share.
Yeah, sure. So basically the volunteer, I haven't got my stuff to plug in, but the volunteer, you can use an app or the web to claim an expense, which is very straightforward. It takes them less than 30 seconds. They put the detail of the claim, they put a picture of the receipt, and they hit send. And then that comes to you. You get a notification as the volunteer manager, and you can just approve or you can send it back. So if you approve it, it will go and queue up. And by 5 o'clock that day, we kind of take the money from the charity and reimburse the volunteers. If you don't approve it and we allow you to send a message back to the volunteer to say, for example, can you please submit a receipt, or can you please explain what, whatever questions, that will go back as a notification straight away to the volunteer. So that back and forth that's normally done via email and takes days and weeks is done instantly with vHelp, and you have a full audit trail of absolutely everything that took place. So it goes back to the volunteer fixes whatever it is, they can send it back to you, and then you can approve it. And what we do with the volunteers, when they sign up to vHelp for the first time, we ask them for their bank details, and only the first time, and then we reimburse them by putting that money directly into their bank account. Normally they get the money within 24 hours of the approval of the claim.
So the charity doesn't put their bank accounts on there as well. You have to actually ask for the money from the charity, and then the charity does a transfer via vHelp.
So exactly. So the charity will kind of store their card details with us. And so we take the money from the charity and distribute it among us, the volunteers. But we only charge the charity the money that they've approved as expenses. So let's say if you had 3 expenses at £10 on that particular day and you approve them all, at the end of the day, we take £30 from you and distribute it among us, those 3 volunteers.
Okay, so is there any fee for the charity to have access to this?
Yes, absolutely. So there is, so for charities, we charge £1 per transaction with 1.5% of the value of the transaction. Shall I put my website on the chat so you can see the pricing is there? And
When you say a transaction, Randa, are you talking about a single payment or is it a group of payments from the organisation?
it's a single payment.
Okay.
And the volunteer can put in a couple. So you can find the details under vhelp.co.uk. But the volunteer can put in up to 2 receipts within a particular transaction. So if you want, you can have 2 transactions within one, basically. Flora, drop me a line and I'm more than happy to also kind of give you a quick demo with screens and proper demo.
Okay.
I've put my email in the chat.
Does anybody else have any questions for Randa at this point?